Now we go back to globalization. Earlier when I talked about it, I emphasized how we have these key shifts. And so while I was going through all those historical eras and key revolutions, it all builds up really here in demography or population geography. We can very clearly see some shifts, some dramatic changes when we look at population globally. So we think about human history, like I mentioned beforehand, for the entirety, for 95% of human history, we are hunters and gatherers. However, that started to change about 15,000 years ago. Of course, once again, this is all prevailing theory. And so when we think about more recently, today, the last 15,000 years, that's when we start to see settlement. That's when we start to see domestication of agriculture and livestock and all of that. So when we focus in on these last 15,000 years, we can see a general trend. We can see this particular pattern, and we call that the J-curve. And this J-curve, this exponential population growth, we really see towards the right, essentially, in the most recent past. So we think about this particular pattern. We think about the first agricultural revolution, a very, very slow transition, a very, very slow revolution from going from hunters and gatherers to actually domesticating agriculture. We've already mentioned this didn't happen at the same time everywhere, but it happened independently in a lot of different parts of the world, of different zones, as we've mentioned. But we can see, for the most part, this orange line, for the entirety of the first agricultural revolution, it, for the most part, trends up. But it has those ups and downs, So those are largely related to infectious disease, droughts, famines, all kinds of things in which you had these natural population checks. But nonetheless, population did grow. During that first agricultural revolution, it makes sense. People had more consistent diets, more consistent food sources. They're producing much more, and so agriculturally, we're more productive than we were as hunters and gatherers. But then comes the big change. First off, a change before the big change is something we see starting in about the 1300s all the way up until the 1500s, 1600s, was the impact of the bubonic plague or the Black Death. So both of those were just major as far as their devastation to overall world population, and we can actually see that downturn in this particular J-curve. But we look more recently. We look in the most far right of this particular curve. What I just did is I just highlighted the 20th century. So just 100 years, just a little sliver. When we think about even 15,000 years ago or even 250,000 years ago, we can see a dramatic change, a dramatic shift. And so demographically, what's that related to? It's related to the Industrial Revolution. And its neighbor, its friend, its good neighbor, the second agricultural revolution. So essentially, we come back, the reason why I bored you with all that stuff earlier on in this text is because it comes back here and we can see the Industrial Revolution. Essentially, we're creating new things, creating new inventions, creating new solutions to problems. And so subsequently, we started to live longer over time. All this I'll explain a little bit more going forward. But essentially, we see the 20th century, in which you were born, was the most dramatic population century there will ever be in the history of human beings. So if you were born in the 20th century, wow, good on you. You were born during the most dramatic century there will ever be in human history when we look at demographics. This is something, if I was giving a lecture on campus or in front of you, I'd be standing on a table emphasizing how unbelievably cool, unbelievably amazing this particular pattern is, as far as this recent dramatic increase in population. Here's another way to showcase this growth. And so what this is this overall world population, us getting to certain points. And so going from the bottom, it took essentially 250,000 years ago all the way up till 1830 or thereabouts to reach 1 billion in population. Then it took another 100 years to add another billion, and then we can see over time, and what the orange part that's flashing is the 20th century. So you can see how the 20th century, when we think about how we went from 1 billion to now over 7 billion, the 20th century is where that growth really took place. Further, we can see over time how it really started to accelerate there in the second half of the 20th century. You can see how that rate went from 100 years to get to a billion, to add another billion. So 29 years to add another billion, to 15, 13, 12, and you're actually seeing the numbers start to slow down a bit, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later on. So what caused this growth? First off, a massive decline in death rates. people living longer. So essentially, the British Agricultural Revolution, as we've already mentioned, combined with some advancements in medicine and biology, the Industrial Revolution, for example, coming up with plastics, for example, coming up with vaccinations, then helped to lead to people living longer. And so then the outcome of this, as that then spreads globally, is more and more people are going to live longer, and this is going to happen rather quickly as communication and transportation advancements allow information and people to get from one place to another much faster. And so no longer are you seeing people dying of starvation and famine or just because of crappy diet. You might see that in certain situations, but it's usually just a distribution problem. We're producing enough food. Technology-wise, we're doing that. We're taking care of providing enough food for human population. So we think about the 20th century, the most dramatic century that will ever be in the history of human beings. So now we'll look a little closer at this particular century. First off, population, it nearly quadrupled. And I'm not someone that makes you memorize numbers, but just think about this. We were in 1900. Population of the world was 1.6 billion. You take 1.6, you flip those numbers around, 6.1 billion by 2000. So in 100 years, we went from 1.6 to 6.1. And so later on this semester, when we look at environmental change, there's no doubt that more people on the earth is going to cause more environmental change. And so I'm not saying that humans cause every single environmental change, but it makes sense that all of a sudden now we're going to be seeing changes as we go from essentially 1.6 to 6.1. Further, we look at particular year, 1967 was the highest one-year population growth rate that was ever in recorded history. So it might not look alike. Like that's a lot. 2.1%, big deal. But as far as human history, that is the highest rate that was ever been recorded and will probably ever be recorded as far as we know. Further, the largest one-year population increase, and so the largest increase to a population, 1987, in which there was 93 million people added during that calendar year. So what I'm getting to here is we're starting to see a pattern in which the second half of the 20th century is really where you see a large population growth. Further, we saw the shortest time for the population to double. It took only 39 years for our population to double. And so we went from 3 to 6 billion, only took 39 years. That's not a lot of time, and once again, we'll never see a doubling time like that ever again. Further, also we see the shortest time to add 1 billion persons. So the latter half of the 20th century, in fact, the last part of the 20th century, we saw took only 12 years to add 1 billion persons. It took to add the next billion, it took 13 years. And so what you're seeing is things are starting to slow down, though. And so once again, the second half of the 20th century, especially, you'll never see a demographic century like that in the history of the world. How cool is that you lived during that? So what caused this major change? Well, first off, we can see revolutionary declines in mortality. And so revolutionary, of course, a big word. We've talked about this beforehand, but major changes. People living longer. And so 1900, the average earthling lived to be 30 years old. By 2000, that was over doubled to 65 years old. And so essentially what's going on there is the advancements in medicine, advancements in the spread of medical information, essentially medical awareness, but combined with all kinds of industrial revolution, all kinds of inventions, the discovery era of coming up with new ideas, science, education, and so all of that leads to this increasing population, essentially because people live longer. At the same time, though, we had unprecedented declines in terms of fertility, or in terms of the number of children a woman or an average earthling will have. And I'll come back and explain this. It's kind of weird. You're like, wait a minute. How can a woman have 5.2 children? But we'll explain that a little bit later on. But on average, a woman had over 5 children in 1900. By 2000, the global average was less than 3. What's going on there? Well, a few different things. But for the most part, it's improvement in gender equality. Women having much more of a say in terms of reproduction. And so essentially women becoming not baby makers, but actually someone who's, actually gainfully employed, working in the, local industry, working in the local community, and so more than just reproducers. And so we think about women's equality, we can really see this in the United States. And in the United States, most universities have more women than men. And so we really see women's equality there, whereas you go to other parts of the world, not so much. But you still see some gender equality issues. You still see women not getting paid as much as men, but for the most part throughout the world, what's happening is women are getting an education, women are starting a family, women are getting married. They're the ones that are kind of controlling things, but also deciding when reproduction occurs. This kind of goes hand in hand with the next one, and that's in terms of increases in literacy or level of education. So we think about 1850, 10% of the world population could read and write. Today, it's about 80%. So what you can see is what that means is it's going to spread information, spread awareness, spread ideas. And so the do's and don'ts, let's say, as far as medical awareness. So all this combines with, when we think about how do women become equal, well, they learn of different situations, across other places in the world, and they're like, well, they're having, they have gender equality, why can't we? And so then you start getting this set in motion. Women become literate, also throughout the world, more and impoverished become literate, and so then they can then rise up the socioeconomic ladder. So this is something that's happening across the world, and definitely characteristic of the 20th century. Finally, something we're definitely continuing going to see, but is a definite characteristic of the 20th century, is massive amounts of international migration. So once again, throughout the whole entire human history, we have nothing like the international migration we see today, in which we have students coming from all over the world to study in Indiana. So when we think about globalization, no doubt a more recent characteristic is migration, which is going to be something we'll cover in a later chapter. When we think about migration, one particular type of migration that definitely goes along with industrial revolution and the second agricultural revolution is the fact that more and more people are moving to cities. So the industrial revolution provided more jobs for people in the cities, but also what we saw was the second agricultural revolution, the British agricultural revolution. What it did was it mechanized agriculture. No longer do we need people living in rural areas. And so those two working hand in hand, we continue to see this particular pattern. And so for every 2 seconds, and so I've been talking for probably nearly 30 seconds, so just think of how many people are moving to cities just in the time that I've been talking. And if we think about an entire day, about 180,000 people per day across the world decide, I'm no longer going to live in a rural area, I'm going to move to an urban area. So a key theme of the 20th century, but even more so in the 21st century, is increased urbanization. So this is something you're going to continue to see. When we think about this, it relates to, once again, those revolutions. And so 1800, we had only 3% of the population in the world was living in cities. That makes sense. We're mostly agrarian. We're mostly agriculturally based. However, by 1900, the Industrial Revolution starts to kick in certain parts of the world. We see we're up to 14%. Then essentially industrialization goes global, and then we can see how across the world you see this massive increase all the way up to 45% by 2000, and then even further, how cool is this? You were living during the one moment in time, there's only going to be one of these, more than likely, that there will be more people living in urban areas than rural areas. And so that switch from people, city dwellers being a minority to majority happened about 2007, 2008, somewhere in there. And now we see by 2050 that'll be up to 70%. And so what this means is more and more people are moving to cities. And so 1960 there was about 1 billion people in the world that lived in cities. By 2030, so not too far off from now, there will be 5 billion people living in cities. And so just essentially in one generation, the urban population, particularly in developing countries, particularly in poorer countries of the world, will double. Will be the key areas for much of these increases, much of these growths. So what's happening is you're having the emergence of what we call megacities. What is a megacity? First off, it's rapidly growing, but it has to have this particular formula. It has to have at least 10 million people. So to be a megacity, you have to have 10 million people and be growing quite rapidly. Now let's look at the rise of the megacities. In 1975, Tokyo was the largest city in the world, had 26 million people. And we think about at that time, it was by far the largest, and there are only even 2 other cities in the world that surpassed that 10 million resident requirement for a megacity. We think about just in the near future, by 2025, the United Nations says that we'll probably have 27 cities that will have at least 26 million people. And so at that one time, Tokyo was this major city, the biggest city in the world. Now we're going to have about 27 that we're about that size. So essentially what's going on is the megacities are just essentially magnets, attracting people. And that's going to be something we'll come back to later in the semester. So this massive rural to urban migration. Where are they going? Where are they coming from? All this stuff to be determined, to be discussed. So here's a chart that shows the largest urban areas in the world. And so I ask you, based on megacities, based on the requirement, how many megacities are there in the world here in, let's say, 2014, some of the most recent data? And if you calculate it, there should be 29. Because if you looked over there, the population estimate, we can see as far as the cities that are above 10 million, go down to London, and we look over to the left, it is ranked number 29. So there's 29 cities currently that are over, currently being 2014, so of course this is going to be a little dated, 2014 that are over the megacity requirement of 10 million people. In the section that follows, I'm going to show and explain these different maps a little bit more in depth. But what I'm going to do here is I'm going to show this particular 1 AD, so we think about Jesus' time. At Jesus' time, what world population looked like. This is a proportional symbol map. And so what it shows is most of the world population, like we've mentioned beforehand, overwhelmingly there in the Afro-Eurasian zone. So somewhere there in Europe or Asia especially. So essentially, moral of the story, China and India have always been big. And what I'm going to do is just go through time, and we're going to look at some changes. And so all I really want you to focus in on just looking at the changing shapes over time. So to do this, I'm going to play this and loop these maps going chronologically in order. And then eventually, hopefully, we'll kind of see some trends as far as what's happened historically, what's happening more recently, and then what's going to happen in the future.